Before we start, wouldn't you please join me in prayer? May the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be always pleasing to you, dear Lord. You are our rock, our Redeemer, our Savior. Amen. Today's scripture focus can be found in the book of James, chapter 1, verse 5, which reads, "If any of you is lacking in wisdom, ask God, who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly." So, do you know the difference between intelligence and wisdom? If so, how old were you when you realized there was a difference between intelligence and wisdom? I was 16 years old when I found out the hard way that being intelligent doesn't necessarily mean you are wise. I tried to do what a typical American teenager does when they turn 16. I tried to get my driver's license. Oh, I was quite confident that I would get a license on my first try because, after all, I had answered every question correctly on that written test. What I didn't realize, however, was that the written test is totally different from the actual driving test. See, when you're taking the written test, I knew that an S-turn was the correct maneuver for parallel parking, not a Y-turn or a U-turn. But during the driving test, that knowledge between an S, Y, or U-turn was useless when it actually came down to parallel parking my dad's station wagon. Major fail. So to make the story short, I didn't get my license until my fourth try, despite having scored 100% on that written test. You don't want to know why I failed on the second and the third attempts, because the stories are similar. It didn't matter that I knew all the rules of the road. What mattered was whether I knew how to apply that knowledge. James is the author of one of our scripture readings today. As some of you may already know, James is thought to have been one of Jesus' brothers. If anyone knows firsthand about being wise in faith, James is a good candidate. James eventually applied Jesus' teachings to his life, even if he had initially rejected his own brother. But I don't really blame him or his siblings. Can you just imagine? Imagine growing up with God himself. Can you imagine James and Jude, who's another author of a book in the New Testament? Can you imagine James and Jude and his other siblings fighting with Jesus over that last piece of hot bread Mary placed on the dinner table? Well, that's a common occurrence at my house. Well, it was probably difficult for Jesus' siblings to accept Jesus as God, since they lived in the same house with him. I mean, if one of my siblings who tattled on me, who played tricks on me, or who treated me mean or teased me, suddenly claimed he was the Messiah, yeah, I would seriously question his sanity. In fact, in Mark chapter 6, verses 1 to 3, it says, "He left that place and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. On the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astounded. They said, 'Where did this man get all this? What is this wisdom that has been given to him? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?' And they took offense at him." Jesus was one of the boys growing up in the home of the local carpenter. Nothing had set him apart physically from his brothers. So how did he have such an incredible ability to teach, to minister, and to perform miracles? the townspeople couldn't get past the fact that they had watched this man grow up since he was a kid. They refused to believe in him. Jesus told them in Mark chapter 6, verse 4, prophets are not without honor except in their hometown and among their own kin and in their own house. It wasn't just his hometown that refused to give him honor, but also his own relatives and his own household. The Apostle John tells us in John 7, verse 5, not even his brothers believed him, at least not until they saw him raised from the dead. 3 days after their half-brother Jesus was arrested, tortured, and publicly put to death, he appeared again, alive. Now they knew. Now they believe. At least 2 of them did. Although we don't know what happened to Joseph and Simon, we do know that James and Jude went on to become apostles, preaching the gospel, assumed leadership positions in the early church, and were considered the authors of 1 book each in the New Testament. James and Jude were able to get past what they knew of Jesus firsthand, the knowledge of Jesus as a brother, so that they could listen to Jesus' message, to apply Jesus' teachings to their lives. Now, I feel like I would have gotten along with James had we been contemporaries. Notice that, contrary to the other apostles' writings, James doesn't waste ink and paper with long and fancy greetings. James only has 1 word to greet the people he was writing to. Greetings. Now, don't count the part where it says, James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion. That doesn't really count because that's like reading the heading part of a letter. That section is the to and from part of the letter, almost like an envelope section. James' letter starts with that 1 word, greetings. I like that because working in a law firm, I tend to like to get the topic right away. Because we bill the clients for our time, so the less time spent on small talk, the less charges the client receives from us. So, way to go, James. Greetings. Then he immediately goes straight to his message. Count it all joy, brothers and sisters, when you meet trials of any kind. Kind of abrupt and to the point, but hey, that's James. The people that James addressed this letter to were going through a tough time. Notice he addressed the letter to the 12 tribes in the dispersion. At this time, the followers of Jesus, who still considered themselves Jewish, had been forced to flee from Jerusalem when Stephen was stoned to death by the Jewish leaders. The followers of Jesus were now being considered as heretics or cult members by leaders of the Jewish faith. So most of the apostles scattered throughout Judea and Samaria to avoid persecution by their Jewish brothers. But James stayed in Jerusalem. And this is where James' letter comes in. James wanted to encourage the followers of Jesus, to remind them how they should be among the Gentiles outside of Jerusalem, how they should live with them. James knew that the new Christians were facing very difficult times. Difficult times as in they had to meet secretly in someone's house because they would have been subject to death by stoning. Difficult times as in they were being accused of cannibalism because they were eating Jesus' body and drinking Jesus' blood. Difficult times as in they were promoting gender equality by allowing women to worship with men. Difficult times indeed because they were going against all the cultural norms and expectations. These were the kinds of difficulties that tested their faith. But James said that they should consider it all joy because the testing of their faith produces endurance, and to let endurance have its full effect so that they may be mature and complete, lacking in nothing. James told them to consider their difficult times to be all joy. Every difficulty, every trial, every test, they should all be considered joy. In Greek, the word consider carries with it the meaning of authority. It literally means to lead the way, to go first, or to guide. You lead or guide, not your circumstances themselves, but you lead or you guide your responses to them. You can't control whether someone crashes or steals your car when it's parked on the street. But you have control and authority to choose whether it will rob you of your joy in Christ or not. I had a Christian friend of mine whose car was what you kids might call all pimped out. He loved that car so much. Every paycheck he would spend something to decorate that car, be it new rims or new seat covers. The car was so overly decorated, you couldn't ignore it. Well, I guess the car thieves noticed it too because his car was stolen. We all thought he would be devastated since this pimped out car was his baby, literally. But when I approached him about it, his response was, "I thank God it was stolen. I was beginning to idolize that car, and I hope whoever has it now enjoys it as much as I did." That Christian man counted it a joy that his car was stolen. You can't stop bad things from happening in this life, but you can stop it from burning you out. Now, this applies to everything, every single thing. It is all to be considered joy. Now, I looked up the words all and joy to see what they originally meant in Greek. And yep, all means all, and joy means joy. So if you put it all together, we are to guide all trials, difficulties, or what I consider distractions, obligations, and temptations, or dots. We are all to consider them into joy. Continually guiding all our trials into joy is what John Wesley, one of the founders of Methodism, what he would call being in your continuous way of Christian perfection. For you see, the ultimate result of guiding trials into joy is a mature Christian, one who is closely walking in the footsteps of Jesus. Our faith will continually be tested. Each time we pass a test, we gain endurance and we grow in the strength of our faith. It's like learning how to read. You build on what you've learned from before. So how did you learn how to read? You probably started learning when you recognized the alphabets. Then you learned their unique sounds. Next, you learned that 2 or more letters produced words. And then you learned that several words together made a sentence. Sentences grew into paragraphs, paragraphs became pages, and then wow, you just read a whole book all by yourself. Now you take reading for granted, no longer remembering how you struggled to differentiate between an M and an N, or a B from a D. That's what faith tests are. Once you pass a single one, you gain confidence and you grow in strength. The longer you walk with Jesus, the more intense the testings are. Because like a child who has learned his ABCs, you will have more satisfying experiences waiting for you once you learn how to read. You will not be fully satisfied or feel complete just knowing your alphabets. For your own sake, you need to keep learning, and your tests need to be more challenging each time so that your endurance builds. And it didn't stop at learning how to read, because you also now know how to write. You also know how to type on a computer and text on your phone. Learning how to read doesn't necessarily mean you know how to write. And if you studied another language, you know what I'm talking about. Writing requires a whole new set of knowledge. So is learning how to type in a computer. I mean, the letters are not placed alphabetically. QWERTY. Who thought of that? And certainly texting on phones. It's a whole new concept for people like me and older. New forms of spelling have to be learned, and emoticons have to be learned. Continual learning and growth and testing for faith, it never ends. Now, I don't want to confuse you and leave you thinking that God tests us, as in tempts us. God tempts no one. Test is a word similar to love in that it has several connotations. Test can mean examine or prove, but don't think of the word tempt. As James said in verse 13, no one, when tempted, should say, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself tempts no one. God does, however, examine our hearts and sometimes asks us to prove our love. Abraham, for example, was tested or examined by God. God examined Abraham's heart to see if Abraham was worthy of being the father of future generations of his chosen people. Abraham passed the test or gave proof of his love to God by willing to sacrifice his son Isaac. God does not actually cause bad things to happen to us to test us. Nowhere does it mention in the Bible that God placed evil, pain, or suffering in anyone's way in order to test someone. Now, there are instances where God allowed it, such as in the case of Job, but there are no instances where God actually placed suffering in anyone's path. The only places in the Bible where God causes what we might, in our finite wisdom, consider bad things to happen is as a punishment to sin. But that's a topic for another sermon or two. In our finite wisdom, bad things or dots or trials or whatever you may call it, the world considers them in a negative light. But as Christians, we consider all of them joy. My Christian friend considered it a good thing when his car, a souped-up Chevy Cavalier Z24, was stolen, and hoped it brought joy to its new owner. That picture doesn't do justice. It's the only picture I could get. His car was souped up, pimped out to the max. But he learned his lesson. He learned his lesson and he replaced that sexy car with the not as sexy but practical SUV, the Nissan Pathfinder. Now, this happened about 20 years ago, but I remember it because I, as a baby Christian, I couldn't understand why he wasn't as upset as I thought he should be. And then not only did he hope that the new owner enjoyed and appreciated all the upgrades that he put into it, he prayed for the person or persons who stole his car. I was like, what? Who does that? Who prays for the thieves who stole his much beloved and decked out car? Well, apparently a Christian who was very wise in his faith. See, it took the theft of his car to realize that his love for the car was slowly replacing his love for the Lord. He also realized that all the money spent on the accoutrement that he bought, they could have all gone towards his tithe. He said he was lacking in wisdom, and although he didn't ask for more wisdom, God gave it to him in the form of a car theft. Now, wisdom is not the same thing as knowing things about Christ and Christianity. Wisdom is the ability in situations to pause and consider God's perspective on any and all events. We are all lacking in wisdom in one way or another because we are all in different stages of our Christian life. It doesn't matter whether it's a 3-year-old, who didn't know the difference between an M and an N, or if it's a 16-year-old who didn't know there was a difference between a writing and a driving test. They both acquired wisdom through God's grace. And for the 3-year-old who wrote his brother's name on the wall with an M instead of an N, only God's grace and his mother's sense of awe and humor saved his behind from his father's spanking. He has acquired wisdom now that he's had time to pause and consider not only God's perspective on getting innocent siblings in trouble, but also time to consider how much larger his older brother is. And for that 16-year-old who thought that driving a car is as easy as memorizing a booklet, only God's grace and patience of her boyfriend, who later became her patient husband, allowed her to obtain her driver's license at the age of 18. She has also acquired wisdom when she realized that life must be lived and experienced rather than read or memorized out of a book. And if any of you is lacking in wisdom, whatever stage of Christian life you are currently in, ask God for it. Sometimes God places people next to you so that we can gain wisdom, whether we ask for it or not. But if you specifically ask God for wisdom, James reminds us that God will give it to all, generously and ungrudgingly. That is, without hesitation or reserve. Our scripture focus today reminds us that we are to ask wisdom from God. Intelligence, we can get that from books and Google. Wisdom, that comes from God, God alone. Putting into action what we have learned so far from Jesus' teaching, that comes from the Holy Spirit. And I pray now that the Lord infuse all of us with love and wisdom.